3 weeks into the Henderson Pool standoff, Karen's morning routine had evolved into something resembling surveillance. She positioned her elliptical machine directly facing their backyard, timing her workouts to coincide with the family's pool activities. Today, however, something was different. Tom Henderson was installing a higher fence. Karen nearly fell off her machine. A higher fence. She grabbed her binoculars, purchased, she told Doug, for bird watching, and confirmed her worst fears. The new fence would be 8 feet tall, completely blocking her view of their backyard activities. How was she supposed to monitor compliance from behind a privacy barrier? Her phone buzzed with a call from Margaret. "Karen, did you see what they're doing? It's like they're trying to hide something." "They're trying to circumvent proper oversight," Karen replied, her voice tight with indignation. "But I have other methods." That afternoon, Karen made an emergency trip to Henderson Pool and Spa Supply. She'd done her research. If the Hendersons thought they could hide behind a fence, they were about to learn that Karen Pemberton was 3 steps ahead. "I need pool chemicals," she announced to the teenage clerk, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "What kind of chemicals, ma'am?" Karen consulted her phone, where she'd saved screenshots from various online forums. "I need something that will teach people about proper pool maintenance. Something educational." The kid's confusion was palpable. "Do you have a pool?" "I'm conducting an experiment in neighborhood improvement," Karen replied cryptically. She left the store with bags full of pH adjusters, algicides, and various powders she'd convinced herself were necessary for her plan. If the Hendersons wanted to play games, she'd show them what a real game looked like. That night, under cover of darkness, Karen scaled her own fence. At 52, she was surprisingly agile, fueled by righteous indignation and 3 cups of coffee. The Hendersons' backyard was quiet, their pool glowing like a beacon in the darkness. Karen approached the pool's edge, her heart hammering. She'd never done anything this direct before, but desperate times called for creative enforcement. She began adding her carefully researched chemical cocktail to their pool. Not enough to be dangerous. She wasn't a monster, but enough to turn their crystal-clear water into something resembling swamp soup. By morning, they'd have a green, cloudy mess that would take weeks to fix. "This is what happens when you don't follow the rules," she whispered to herself, dumping the last container. The next morning, Karen positioned herself at her window, coffee in hand, waiting for the Henderson family to discover her handiwork. She didn't have to wait long. Sarah's scream of horror was audible through Karen's double-paned windows. Tom, what happened to our pool?" Karen watched as the family gathered around their now toxic-looking swimming hole. The water had turned an alarming shade of green-brown, with foam floating on the surface like some kind of primordial soup. Tom was on his phone immediately. "Yes, I need an emergency pool service." "No, I don't know what happened. It was fine yesterday evening." Karen sipped her coffee with satisfaction. Sometimes leadership required taking difficult actions. The Hendersons would thank her eventually, once they understood that rules existed to protect everyone. Her satisfaction lasted exactly 47 minutes. "Mrs. Pemberton," Doug called from the front door. "There are 2 police officers here to see you." Karen's confidence evaporated faster than chlorine in sunshine as Detective Martinez and Officer Williams stepped into her living room. Her carefully constructed world of righteous rule enforcement suddenly felt less heroic and more criminal. "We're investigating reports of property tampering," Detective Martinez said, consulting his notebook. "The Henderson family's pool was chemically contaminated sometime last night." "How unfortunate," Karen replied, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I hope they figure out what went wrong with their maintenance routine." Officer Williams, a young woman with sharp eyes, was studying Karen's face intently. "Funny thing is, Mrs. Henderson mentioned you've been having disputes with the family about HOA violations." "I enforce community standards," Karen said, lifting her chin defiantly. "Someone has to maintain property values in this neighborhood." "Right?" Detective Martinez nodded. "And where were you last night between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m.? Karen's mouth went dry. "Here, at home, with my husband." She glanced toward Doug, who was hovering in the doorway looking like he wanted to disappear entirely. He gave her a weak nod of support, but she could see the questions forming in his eyes. After the police left, Karen paced her living room like a caged tiger. She'd covered her tracks, disposed of the chemical containers in 3 different dumpsters across town, washed her clothes twice, even cleaned under her fingernails. But something about Officer Williams' expression suggested they weren't done with her. Her phone rang. "Margaret." "Karen, the police were just at my house asking questions about you. What's going on?" "Nothing I can't handle," Karen replied, but her voice cracked slightly. The next few days were torture. Karen maintained her usual HOA patrol schedule, issuing violation notices for overgrown hedges and incorrectly positioned garden gnomes. But her heart wasn't in it. Every time she saw a police car, her chest tightened. Every knock at the door made her jump. The worst part was Doug. He'd started looking at her differently. Not with his usual resigned acceptance of her HOA obsession, but with something that looked uncomfortably like disappointment. "Karen," he said one evening as she frantically reorganized her violation files, "maybe it's time to step back from the HOA for a while." "Step back?" She whirled around, her voice rising to a pitch that made their dog whimper. "Douglas, I am the only thing standing between this neighborhood and complete anarchy. You contaminated someone's pool." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Karen realized she'd never actually admitted it out loud, even to herself. Seeing Doug's horrified expression made it real in a way that terrified her. "I was protecting property values," she whispered, "by poisoning someone's swimming pool where children play." That night, Karen lay awake staring at the ceiling. When had she become this person? When had neighborhood enforcement become chemical warfare? She thought about Sarah Henderson's scream, about their 6-year-old son who loved to cannonball into the now ruined pool. The next morning brought a registered letter that made her hands shake. A lawsuit from the Henderson family for property damage, emotional distress, and legal fees. The cleanup costs alone were over $8,000. But it was the second piece of mail that really shattered her world. A petition signed by 37 of her neighbors, calling for her immediate removal from the HOA board. Karen read through the signatures, recognizing each name. These were people she tried to help, people whose property values she protected through years of vigilant enforcement. Mrs. Chen, whose roses she'd saved from a neighbor's encroaching sprinkler system. Bob Martins, whose home value increased after she forced the removal of an unsightly shed next door. Traitors, all of them. But as she sat in her pristine kitchen, surrounded by the ruins of her carefully constructed authority, Karen began to realize that maybe, just maybe, she'd been fighting the wrong war all along. The emergency HOA meeting was standing room only, which hadn't happened since the great mailbox controversy of 2019. Karen sat at the head table, her usual position of power now feeling more like a defendant's chair. 37 signatures had demanded this meeting, and 37 pairs of eyes were staring at her with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright hostility. Tom Henderson stood to address the room, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of barely controlled anger. "When we moved to Maple Grove Estates, we thought we were joining a community. Instead, we got a dictatorship." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Karen's grip tightened on her gavel, though she wasn't sure she still had the authority to use it. "The pool incident was the last straw," Sarah Henderson continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Our son asked me if the mean lady was going to hurt our pool again. A 6-year-old shouldn't have to worry about whether his swimming pool is safe." Karen wanted to stand, to defend herself, to explain about property values and rule enforcement. But Doug's hand on her arm kept her seated. For once in their marriage, he was the one taking charge. "My wife," Doug began, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "has lost sight of what community actually means." He looked at Karen with something that might have been pity. She forgot that we're neighbors, not adversaries. The vote was swift and decisive. 34-3 to remove Karen from the HOA board, with 2 abstentions. Karen had never felt so utterly alone. In the parking lot afterward, Margaret approached her, the one ally she thought she could count on. I'm sorry, Karen, Margaret said quietly. But you went too far. I was protecting our neighborhood. Karen's voice cracked with desperation. You were controlling it. There's a difference. Driving home, Karen's mind raced through the last few years. When had enforcing rules become more important than the people those rules were supposed to serve? When had she stopped seeing neighbors and started seeing violations? The lawsuit settlement cleaned out their savings account. Doug started working overtime to cover the legal fees, coming home later and later each evening. Their dinner conversations, once filled with Karen's daily reports of neighborhood infractions, became stilted affairs punctuated by uncomfortable silences. Karen found herself with nothing to do. No violation notices to write, no compliance reports to file, no meetings to attend. She was just a neighbor, an ordinary resident with no special authority or purpose. 3 weeks after her removal, she was watering her prized roses when she heard splashing from the Hendersons' backyard. Their pool was crystal clear again, filled with the sounds of childhood joy that had once irritated her so much. Almost without thinking, she found herself walking to their fence. Through a gap in the boards, she could see their son teaching a friend how to hold their breath underwater. Their laughter was infectious, genuine, purely happy. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Karen spun around to find Sarah Henderson standing at her own gate, holding a basket of fresh tomatoes from her garden. Yes, Karen stammered, unsure how to interact with someone she'd considered an enemy for so long. Sarah studied her for a moment, then did something unexpected. She smiled. Not sarcastically or cruelly, but with genuine warmth. Would you like some tomatoes? I always grow more than we can eat. Karen stared at the offered basket, seeing not just vegetables, but an olive branch, a chance at something she hadn't experienced in years. Actual community. I'd like that, she whispered. As Sarah handed over the tomatoes, their fingers brushed briefly. You know, Sarah said softly, the HOA president position is open, but maybe this time we could find someone who sees neighbors instead of violations. Karen nodded, tears threatening to spill over. Maybe we could. Walking back to her house, tomatoes in hand, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not for control or authority, but for redemption. For the chance to be part of something instead of standing apart from it. But as she reached her front door, she noticed something that made her pause. Tire tracks in the Hendersons' flower bed, fresh and deep, clearly from someone cutting across their lawn. Her old instincts flared. Her hand reached automatically for the phone to document the violation before she caught herself. Karen stood frozen, holding the tomatoes, caught between the person she'd been and the person she wanted to become. The choice felt monumental, as if her entire future balanced on this single moment. She looked at the tomatoes in her hands, then back at the tire tracks. What would the new Karen do? Karen Pemberton stood in her pristine kitchen, clutching her HOA violation notice clipboard so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Through her bay window, she could see the Henderson family's pool, that pool, sparkling like a sapphire in the afternoon sun. Children's laughter echoed across the fence line, each giggle feeling like a personal assault on her authority. 37 violations this month, she muttered to herself, adjusting her reading glasses. And yet they continue to flaunt the rules. The pool had been the final straw. When the Hendersons installed it last spring, Karen had pored over the HOA bylaws like a legal scholar preparing for the Supreme Court. Section 4.21 clearly stated that pools must be set back 15 feet from property lines. The Hendersons' pool, 14 feet, 11 inches. She'd measured it herself with a surveyor's tape at dawn, crouched behind their fence like some suburban commando. Her husband Doug emerged from his man cave, beer in hand. Karen, honey, maybe you should. Don't. She whirled around, her perfectly coiffed blonde bob swishing with military precision. Don't tell me to let it go, Douglas. Rules exist for a reason. Property values depend on compliance. Doug sighed, recognizing the warning signs. When Karen used his full name, retreat was the only viable option. He'd learned this after 15 years of marriage and countless HOA battles. Karen's phone buzzed, a text from her neighbor ally Margaret. Henderson boy just cannonballed again. Splash went over fence onto my petunias. Perfect. Karen's lips curved into what could generously be called a smile. She'd been waiting for ammunition like this. 20 minutes later, she stood on the Hendersons' doorstep, clipboard armed and ready. Tom Henderson answered, still dripping from the pool, a confused smile on his face. Mrs. Pemberton, what brings you by? I'm here in my official capacity as HOA president, Karen announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been told no as a child. Your pool is in violation of multiple regulations, and I have reports of water trespassing onto neighboring properties. Tom's wife Sarah appeared behind him, toweling off their 6-year-old son. Water trespassing? Karen, kids splash when they swim. It's kind of unavoidable. The bylaws are quite clear about maintaining appropriate boundaries. Karen replied, consulting her clipboard with theatrical importance. I'm issuing a formal violation notice. You have 30 days to remedy the situation. Remedy how exactly? Tom asked, his patience visibly thinning. Karen's smile turned predatory. That's not my problem to solve, Mr. Henderson. Compliance is your responsibility. As she turned to leave, she heard Sarah whisper to Tom, she's completely lost it. Karen paused, her shoulders tensing. Lost it. She was the only thing standing between Maple Grove Estates and complete chaos. Without her vigilance, who knew what horrors awaited? Pink flamingos, mismatched mailboxes. The very thought made her shudder. That evening, she sat in her home office, surrounded by HOA manuals and legal precedents. She'd show them what lost it really meant.